If you've been a fan of primetime television over the last 25 years, you're probably familiar with several, if not all, of the Masterson siblings. Back in the late 90s and early 2000s, the elder two Mastersons, Danny and Chris, starred on Fox's two most popular shows, That 70s Show and Malcolm in the Middle. Danny and Chris being two brothers on two very popular shows was a fact frequently mentioned as a fun bit of trivia, made even more interesting a decade later when Danny and Chris's younger half-siblings, Alanna and Jordan, also became actors on popular television shows. But a piece of Masterson family trivia that wasn't frequently discussed during the height of their fame was the fact that they were all lifelong Scientologists. Most people who know anything about Scientology know how highly celebrities are regarded within the controversial church and how the church will do anything to get and keep celebrity members, including allegedly covering up unspeakable crimes. As over the years, Scientology has been accused of covering up the crimes and burying the secrets of all four Masterson siblings. So that's what we're going to be discussing today, the Church of Scientology and the Masterson family. We'll be covering the scores of accusations that the church higher-ups enabled and covered for Danny Masterson's unspeakable crimes, and the rumors about the other three Masterson siblings. We'll also be discussing the cruel actions of Chris, Alanna, and Jordan to try to help their brother escape the consequences of his actions, including rewriting history, and how the Church of Scientology are breaking their own rules to keep the Mastersons as loyal celebrity members. So sit back, relax, grab a drink and a snack, and let's dive in to the dark and dangerous world of Scientology and the family it's enabled for decades, the Mastersons. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find someone today between the ages of 20 and around 45 who didn't at least know one of the Masterson children. Danny Masterson is the oldest of the family, and while he grew up modeling and acting and appeared in popular shows like Roseanne and big movies like Beethoven 2, his most famous role by far was as Steven Hyde on the Fox show That 70s Show that ran between 1998 and 2006. Danny Masterson did continue working primarily in television for just over a decade after That 70s Show 8-season run, but none of his other roles ever reached the same height as That 70s Show. Danny Masterson's final acting role was in the Netflix series The Ranch that he starred in with his co-star from That 70s Show, who's also his best friend since 1998, Ashton Kutcher. Danny Masterson was fired from The Ranch due to Netflix receiving public pressure to oust him due to an onslaught of legal trouble that was surrounding Masterson at that time in December 2017. And we'll get much more into those legal troubles and what's happening today in just a minute. That 70s Show launched in 1998 and was a massive hit for the Fox network, and it made Danny Masterson and his co-stars extremely famous practically overnight. 2 years later, in January of 2000, Danny Masterson's younger brother, Chris Masterson, was cast as the oldest brother Francis on a new Fox show that was a comedy centered around a family called Malcolm in the Middle. Malcolm in the Middle went on to also be a huge hit for Fox, airing for 7 seasons, and it aired its series finale in May 2006. Malcolm in the Middle was a mid-season replacement for Fox, which had its first season airing only 16 episodes. Most of the time it was 25 episodes, and the first season, because it was a mid-season replacement, aired between January and May of 2000. And as I said, Malcolm in the Middle went on to run for 7 seasons, which was 1 season fewer than That 70s Show. So both Danny and Chris Masterson finished their extremely popular Fox shows within a few days of each other, with the series finale of Malcolm in the Middle airing on May 14th, 2006, and the That 70s Show finale airing just 4 days later on the 18th of May, 2006. Of course, there will be younger people and older people who are familiar with both of these shows due to the fact that both shows lived on via reruns, but millennials especially will remember how popular these shows were when they were airing on Fox. Due to both shows being extremely popular, they've both had, as of today, continuation series air or be filmed. That 70s show had a spin-off continuation series that aired on Netflix called That 90s Show that actually just was cancelled, and that show popped up due to the horrifying fact that we today are the same distance from the 90s as the 70s was when that 70s show premiered, which makes me feel 1,000 years old. That 90s show did mainly focus on the children of that 70s show's characters, although all of the main actors from that 70s show did reappear in some way, some just small cameos. All of them, Ashton Kutcher, Topher Grace, Mila Kunis, Laura Prepon, and Wilder Valderrama, all did pop up at one stage or another. The only actor that did not appear was Danny Masterson, and that was due to his incarceration. And due to his crimes, he and his character were not mentioned at all. There is a Malcolm in the Middle continuation revival series that is currently in post-production, and this new limited series will comprise of 4 episodes where all of the original characters are returning and the show picks up with them in present day. While all of the original characters from Malcolm in the Middle are appearing in this new limited series, one of the actors was recast due to the actor Eric Sullivan exiting Hollywood and having no interest in acting or reprising his role, but Chris Masterson has reprised his role as Francis, and this series was shot already between April and May. They shot it this year, 2025, and the series is set to air on Disney Plus in December of 2025. Like Danny Masterson, Chris Masterson is primarily known for this Fox popular show, Malcolm in the Middle. And while Danny was a series regular on other shows like Men at Work and The Ranch, Chris Masterson did very little other acting work. Danny Masterson did start performing as a DJ shortly after that 70s show ended. If you see anything about his DJing career online, most of the time you'll see him using the name DJ Mom Jeans. However, he did begin his DJ career with a very different, abhorrent, and disgusting name, which came back to really haunt him during his legal trial. So put a pin in that for a second. Danny Masterson also played in the Scientology-centered band Grandpa vs. Prowler, and a lot of the stuff online about this band has been scrubbed. Actually, a lot of stuff about the Mastersons has been scrubbed online, and the reason that I know that is because when I did my original video about Danny Masterson's trial, which was almost 2 years ago now, I always obviously list all my sources. Anyone who watches the channel knows, and if you go to that sourcing list now and try and just click on some of the links, obviously a lot of them are still there, but a lot of the really controversial stuff and certain interviews have been taken down, and I save everything, so I will show some stuff in this video that I still have access to. But a lot of the Grandpa versus Prowler stuff seemed to start to disappear whenever the information came out about the new lead singer from Linkin Park. Emily Armstrong is the new lead singer of Linkin Park, and when she was announced as the new lead, people started obviously looking into her, and they found out she was a Scientologist and that she was friends with Danny Masterson. They were very close, and she actually went to one of his pre-trial hearings for support. Emily Armstrong has claimed that they aren't friends anymore and that she distanced herself, But the language that she uses in the comments that she made about not being friends and distancing herself and not knowing the full story, it's a very Scientology speak. And she never actually talks about Danny Masterson's victims. She talks about victims in general, which is something you'll notice a lot of people that are friends with Masterson or have been caught up in things like this. Ashton Kutcher and Mila Kunis are another perfect example of this. When they did their apology video, they talk about our heart goes out to victims everywhere. Well, okay, that's fine, but why are you not talking about the actual victims that you've harmed? And the reason that a lot of these Scientology people or even Scientology adjacent people like Ashton and Mila do this general speak rather than saying, we are sorry for hurting the victims, we are sorry the victims went through this, is because a lot of the time these people are still friends and aligning themselves with, in this case, Danny Masterson, but also Scientology would never have someone like Emily Armstrong or Ashton and Mila side with the victims because they see the victims as suppressive people and people that are going against Scientology. So that's why they always keep it to these general terms of victims everywhere, because they're trying to eliminate in any possible way addressing the actual victims and acknowledging what actually happened to those victims. And I mentioned Emily Armstrong not just because of her friendship with Danny Masterson, but also because of their music relationship together. Because prior to being the lead singer of Linkin Park, Emily Armstrong was in the band Dead Sarah. And the band that Masterson was in, Grandpa vs. Prowler, they were actually the opening act for a lot of Dead Sarah shows and on some of their tours. They would do tours during the summer, and Grandpa vs. Prowler used to go on tour with them. There is very little video footage left of any of these shows, and a lot of the time the video would be taken down, or sometimes they didn't even allow recording. And there also is just very little remnants of this relationship. And I have spoken about this once before, and a lot of people were really surprised to hear about it. The only place that you really see anything like posters and things like that is on the tiny, now dead Instagram account for Grandpa vs. Prowler. And most of the stuff just is really lost to time. So during the decade after that 70s show and Malcolm in the Middle, Danny Masterson was in Grandpa vs. Prowler and also doing a lot of DJ work. And after Chris Masterson had watched Danny Masterson DJing for a number of years, he then entered into the DJ world, and he went by his middle name, Chris Kennedy, when he used to play. They also did a number of other business endeavors together. They would invest in several restaurants and bars, and some of those projects they would also invest with Ashton Kutcher and Wilmer Valderama, who were Danny Masterson's co-stars from that 70s show, as most people know. And they also did some things in the poker world. That is how I know some other stuff about them. And they also invested in little small projects here and there, like one of the poker magazines, Card Magazine. Both Danny and Chris Masterson were born in Long Island, New York, and as I mentioned earlier, their mother Carol is both of their managers and has been all of their life. Peter Masterson is not a Scientologist, and he had one other son, Danny and Chris's half-brother, Will Masterson. Will Masterson has been a producer at Union Pacific Film for almost 13 years and went to the University of Southern California. Now, I don't know much about Will Masterson, but I did speak to someone extremely in the know and well-connected, knows everything about Scientology and Scientologists, and has spoken to nearly everyone. And he told me that while Will Masterson supports his siblings, that this person I spoke to found Will to be very polite, Will isn't a Scientologist either. And this person also said to me that they would hesitate to paint Will with the same brush as his siblings because he isn't like them in behavior. So I thought that was worth mentioning, since I know a lot of people have been curious about Will Masterson and he isn't really talked about that much. And I know a lot of people have questioned whether he is a Scientologist and things like that as well. Like Peter Masterson, Danny and Chris's mother, Carol Masterson, did remarry as well, and she actually married another Scientologist at the time, Joe Reese. Joe Reese was Australian, but his family was Lebanese, and he also sadly passed away last year. And the situation with him and Danny and Chris's half-siblings is really quite sad. And Joe had done a number of interviews about it, especially towards the end of Danny Masterson's trial and during his sentencing. So Joe and Carol were married and they were Scientologists and active Scientologists together. And a lot of people do ask me about the family tree makeup because it is confusing because of what Danny and Chris's half-siblings did with their last names. So Carol and Joe get married, and Carol has Danny and Chris from her marriage with Peter Masterson, who has another son, Will Masterson, that's Danny and Chris's half-brother. Joe and Carol have 2 kids together. Their first son together was Jordan Masterson, and then they also have a daughter who is the youngest of the family, Alanna Masterson. And some people might be thinking, why are they Masterson whenever Peter Masterson isn't their father and it's not like he's their stepfather or anything like that? But what ended up happening is Joe and Carol were married, they had their kids, and around the time that Jordan was 11 and Alanna was 9, Joe and Carol at this stage were divorced for a few years, and Scientology ended up declaring Joe a suppressive person. So I'm going to explain how it works with suppressive people when it involves underage kids, because it's different to if someone is an adult and declared a suppressive person. Because, well, first of all, I'm sure most people are aware, especially if you watched any of my other videos, in Scientology, if someone is declared a suppressive person and you are a Scientologist, you are supposed to have no contact with this person. If they walk into the store that you're in, you're supposed to leave. You're not supposed to have anything to do with them. They are seen as the lowest of the low. If you are married to a suppressive person like Jason Lee, who was in My Name is Earl, who's also very good friends with Danny Masterson, his first wife actually had a conversation with Giovanni Rivisi's mother, who is also, like Carol Masterson, is her kid's manager. And she basically said that Jason Lee's first wife said, "Oh, I read this book about that was kind of seen as anti-Scientology." And 2 days later, Jason Lee sent a 1-paragraph letter to his wife saying, basically, you're a suppressive person, we're getting divorced. And that was the end of their relationship. So that is how strict this is. And she just read a book. So it's very different with kids, though, that are underage, because while, yes, they don't want anyone to be around suppressive people, Scientology also wants it the other way, where, say, the suppressive person is the one who has primary custody of the kids, they want the Scientologists to be able to see them so they can try and bring the kids back into Scientology. So Carol and Joe are married, they get divorced, and a few years goes by, Joe is declared a suppressive person. His kids are 9 and 11. They can still have a relationship up until the kids turn 18, which is also the case with Tom Cruise. Tom Cruise did not have to, according to Scientology, cut off Suri Cruise. It was only when she was 18. That's why when all these articles started coming out when Suri Cruise was 18 saying, oh, maybe Tom Cruise is going to see her now, you could tell that people that were writing those didn't really know much about Scientology, because it was completely opposite. Like, if there was any chance of him seeing her, it would have been before she turned 18, because once the kids turn 18, they have to make a decision about whether they're going to be Scientologists or have a relationship with a suppressive person. So the situation with Carol and her kids, that was completely their personal choice, because Scientology would have allowed Carol and the kids to see Joe up until his kids were 18. But they didn't want to do that because they, like Tom Cruise, are so deep into Scientology. And so Joe's kids, when they were 9 and 11, that was the last time that he ever saw them, had any relationship with them. And they then changed their name to Masterson, even though they have no ties or relationship with Peter Masterson. They changed it to be the same as their brothers. As I said, Joe Reese did several interviews over the years. He's been on CNN and tons of other interviews, and he's spoken about this kind of rewriting of history that his kids, now that they're adults and they are in the media, they have spoken about their father in a very negative light, and the way that they paint the story, especially in the letters that they wrote to the court on behalf of Danny Masterson, they talk about him abandoning them when their parents got divorced when they were toddlers, like very young, but they had an active relationship for years after the divorce. It was only when he was declared a suppressive person that they completely cut him off, and he tried to reach out to them many times, but they just had no want for a relationship or anything. And as I said, it was really sad that he passed away and they never ever saw him again, or he was never able to have any sort of relationship with them again. As I said, if you hear things from the side of Alanna and Jordan, it sounds as though Joe Reese was not involved with them past when they were little babies, but Joe actually was still very involved with the family when Chris and Danny were on That 70s Show and Malcolm in the Middle. And Joe has talked in interviews about going with Danny to buy his first house when he started getting his big paychecks from That 70s Show. Hi, editing Ash here again, probably, but I just wanted to be a bit more clear on the timeline with Carol and Joe's divorce, because even taking out Joe's word and just looking at the timeline of what actually happened, like legally, divorce-wise and things like that, it's a very different story than what any of the Mastersons wrote in their letters. And Joe and Carol got married in 1985, and they both joined the Sea Org. And if you don't know, the Sea Org is like the most extreme people in Scientology. They're the people that signed the billion-year contract. And you, I believe now, can't actually have kids in the Sea Org, but this was back when you still could. And so they got married, and then Jordan Masterson was actually born in the Sea Org. He was born in Florida, and then they left the Sea Org and moved back to New York, and that's when Alanna Masterson was born. But when that was all going on, basically, as I said, like, the Sea Org is the most extreme Scientology people. And even regular Scientologists, from everything I've been told, the kids are looked at as adults. So there isn't like a lot of parenting and nurturing and things. And because they were in the Sea Org, they would only see the kids like very small amounts of time, like an hour or 2 hours max. This all has been spoken about by many other Scientologists, but Joe himself has talked about this in interviews. And basically, Danny and Chris, their dad, Peter Masterson, was still living in New York. So they would have 50-50 split custody whenever Carol and Joe were living in Florida. Sorry, someone called me in the middle of doing this. So they live in Florida, they're in the Sea Org, They then move back to New York, and Alanna is born there, and they end up going to California, and then in 1998 they get divorced, and that is obviously the year that that 70s show starts. And at this stage, Jordan and Alanna aren't kids. I mean, they're like preteens, teens. And so between 98 and 2005, Joe still involved in their life. And as I mentioned before, he was the person who went with Danny to get his mortgage for his house after that 70s show and stuff like that. But in 2005 is when he was declared a suppressive person. And from that point is when they completely cut him out and they changed their name to Masterson. And also, an interesting thing that Joe mentions in an interview is that his job in Scientology was kind of like a fixer. In the beginning, he used to be flown to high profile people like billionaires and millionaires who had done Scientology classes or been in Scientology, and they wanted refunds, and his job was kind of talking them out of it. And then there was a bunch of other stuff that he did. And there's been some very interesting interviews with Joe, especially around the time that the Danny Masterson trial was going on and the sentencing was happening, and Joe spoke out and was correcting the timeline a lot of this stuff, because obviously the letters went public, and Alanna, Jordan, and Carol all in their letters basically say that they got divorced, their father was a negative influence, and he abandoned them. There was no mention of these 8 years. But in these interviews, Joe talks about how before he was declared suppressive and cut off, that Scientology brought him in to, use his words, fix his son Jordan, who was going down a bad path, and as Joe says, a similar path to Danny. And this was closer to the time that Joe was being declared. Jordan was nearly 20 when Joe was declared and they cut him off and everything. So I do find that a very interesting thing that Joe mentioned. And we know how much Scientology covered up for Danny Masterson, and I'm sure there's a lot of other skeletons in that family's closet, in my opinion.
That's what I did with my son Jordan in 2003. Remember that date, 2003. I was asked to intervene to sort my son out because he was getting audited and set checked at Celebrity Center and they were fucking him over. My ex said, "Joe, you're the only one who can fix guys like this." I said, "Sure, he's my son, I'll fix him." Fixed him, 50 hours of sort out, done. I was going to do that with Danny. Never got that opportunity because the church got pissed off. Why? Because I bypassed the church and sorted out their product. This is where I can't win. They should have said, "Joe, you're good. Let's please come and help this guy. Come and help this guy because we're not getting through. You get through. I don't know what you do. It. No way." Showing them up.
So was Jordan getting into his own messes?
On the same road as my son and my stepson Danny, big time. Now that would have been a bigger story.
And the family obviously had all relocated to California by the time Joe was declared a suppressive person. And that was when Alanna and Jordan were spending a lot of time through, their preteens and teens on the sets of that 70s show and Malcolm in the Middle. So with their mother also being their older brother's manager, they wanted to act as well. And Carol, their mother, then became their manager as well. And some of Jordan and Alanna's first roles were on Malcolm in the Middle and that 70s show. Jordan and Alanna, through the rest of their teens and early 20s, did continue to get roles here and there, mainly one-episode guest star appearances. But Jordan then, in 2005, got a role in Steve Carell's movie The 40-Year-Old Virgin, which is the movie that he's probably still best well known for today. And that was the role of Mark. He then did a couple of other shows like ABC Family's Greek, and his biggest TV show role was in Tim Allen's Last Man Standing, and he actually replaced Nick Jonas on this show. He was a recurring star on the show through seasons 2 and 3, and then he had a regular role in seasons 4 and 9. He did actually direct one episode of Last Man Standing as well, which is usually something a lot of actors that they want to get into directing. If they have been on a show for a significant number of years, sometimes they will work that into a contract, or it will be a nice sort of thing that the show does, because if you can direct an episode of television, it means that you can then get into the Directors Guild, and directing one episode of television and being in the Directors Guild, it really does open a lot of doors. And Jordan ended up directing the episode Paranormal Activity. And although, as I said, a lot of the time this is like a jumping off point for a lot of people that want to go into directing, even a lot of people will stay on their shows if they've been on it for a long, long time, if the show will agree to let them direct more and more episodes. The CW is a network that does this a lot with their stars to kind of retain them. Like Danielle Panabaker on The Flash, she played Caitlin Snow. Every season she'd be directing more and more episodes because you could kind of see that's what she wanted to do. And it was like, okay, I'll stay as my character and stay as a series regular because I kind of get the best of both worlds. I'm still getting my series regular check. The show's still happy because I'm on it, and I'm getting to do what I want to do without taking that leap of not having any acting roles. And it also, again, helps you get your foot in the door and get into the Directors Guild, which isn't easy to do, especially today. There's also on the CW primarily, they will also hire a lot of their stars from previous shows to direct new shows. Like one of the stars, Gregory Smith, of the show Everwood, which was on in the early 2000s on the WB, Chris Pratt was actually in that show, and Sarah Drew from Grey's Anatomy in like very, very early roles. And Gregory Smith was in the lead role. He was on that for 4 seasons, and he actually directs a lot of CW shows today and episodes, because it's kind of like you do your time in the CW being, you know, the younger late teens, early 20s, and then when they're in their late 30s, 40s, they can move into directing. So that is kind of maybe the path that Jordan was trying to go down, but it doesn't seem like he's done anything since then. He hasn't done any directing. And not only did he not do any more directing, but that was actually his last acting role, and that show ended in 2021. I do think that there is a bit of a pattern here, as you'll see with Alanna, that ever since Danny Masterson's trial, there hasn't really been any work for his family. And I think a lot of that had to do with the behavior of his siblings during the trial, because as we'll get into, they really let it be known what their feelings were on their brother. And of course it is their brother, but the crimes that he is found guilty of are absolutely horrendous. And not only did both Jordan and Alanna write character letters for him, but there was a situation with Alanna at the courthouse and one of the victims. So we'll get into that in just a second. But Alanna Masterson, most people probably know her for her role as Tara on The Walking Dead. Like Jordan, and as I mentioned, she did get her first roles in Malcolm in the Middle, and because she was a bit younger, she wasn't on that 70s show, but she did have some minor guest appearances over the years, and her role as Tara really was like her first major role. She was in 6 seasons of The Walking Dead, a total of 61 episodes, which is a fair chunk of time for The Walking Dead, a show that's famous for killing off major characters. And yes, there are characters that were on the entire 11 season run of the show, like Daryl and Carol, but most of the characters, unless they were sticking around for a very long time, they didn't last too many seasons. So her character was there for a pretty significant time. And in regards to her character, I still watched The Walking Dead when her character was on it, and I actually kind of liked her character. I it wasn't like I had any negative feelings towards her, but I remember at the time there was a lot of criticism about her character, and especially like the 5th and 6th seasons that she was on. People were very annoyed by her character basically still being there when her storyline had kind of ended. So I definitely could remember that. But then when I was looking into all of this for the video, there was a lot more negative feelings towards the character than even I remember. And there was also a lot of criticism about her acting as well. So that wasn't really something I remembered, but The Walking Dead wasn't something that I was like super, I watched some YouTube videos and stuff like that here and there, but maybe I wasn't paying that much attention to her when she was on the show and stuff. But I was kind of surprised by the amount of negativity towards her character and towards her acting as well. As I was saying earlier when talking about her and Jordan, some of her earlier roles were in things like Malcolm in the Middle. She was in Danny Masterson's second show, Men at Work, as well. But her first role was actually when she was only 6 in the soap opera The Young and the Restless. I don't think that people would be too surprised to hear that, considering that all 3 of her older siblings were all put into acting when they were children. And given at that stage her brothers are in these wildly popular shows, it's not too much of a leap to think that her mother, who was all of the siblings' manager, is going to also put her into acting, especially due to the money that that family has probably made through all of their kids acting, not even thinking about what they've made when the kids have been 18 and adults. Like Jordan, Alanna Masterson hasn't worked in several years, and the last 2 projects that she did, one was in 2018, the Netflix show Younger, where she had a guest appearance, and her last role was another guest appearance in the 2022 show Leverage Redemption. So it certainly seems as though it wasn't just Danny Masterson that was affected by his actions, trial, and conviction, because the family very much has slowed down their acting work, well, completely stopped it, to be honest, with the exception of Chris Masterson returning in Malcolm in the Middle. But obviously that is a role he got over 20 years ago. And the whole Masterson family, it's not really just their work that's been affected, but very much their public image, especially the actions that all of the siblings took whenever Danny Masterson was on trial. As most people who watch the channel are aware, I have done a very detailed video on Danny Masterson's trial. That was actually the video that made my channel take off in the first place. So if you want a very detailed going over of the timeline and all of the stories and everything leading up to it, I strongly suggest that you watch that video, because it really has all of the nitty-gritty details, because I'm obviously not going to repeat myself in this one. So I'm just going to go over the very broad strokes so that we can more focus on Jordan, Chris, and Alanna, and then talk about Danny Masterson after the trial and what's happened in the intervening 2 years since I did that original video. Additionally, I do also have plans, probably towards the end of the summer, to do a video on a few of the cast members of that 70s show, including Danny Masterson, that will give a lot of updates since the situation 2 years ago when I did most of the videos talking about them. Obviously, people like Laura Prepon, who I did a video on recently, won't really be focused on. This would be more about Danny Masterson's appeal process and the situation with the lawsuit against him and Scientology, and a bit more of a focus on Scientology as a whole. So let me know if you're interested in that and which other cast members you predominantly want me to focus on. So in March 2017, the New news that Danny Masterson was being investigated on charges of rape was broken by the Scientology journalist Tony Ortega on his website, The Underground Bunker, which I strongly suggest, if you want to know anything about Scientology, that you check out Tony's site. I'll have it linked in the sources, and I will also have a number of articles I've used for this video linked down there as well in the Google link in the description box and pinned comment. When Tony broke this news, Masterson was starring on The Ranch on Netflix with Ashton Kutcher, and he and Kutcher were also executive producing the show. This news broke in March, but for almost a year, Netflix did nothing and Masterson remained on the show. By December 2017, more victims had come forward and Masterson was being investigated for 4 counts of rape by December 2017. The only reason that Masterson ended up being fired from Netflix was because one of the Netflix executives, Andy Yeatman, was at a soccer game and was approached by a woman who her kid was also playing in the soccer game. Yeatman was there with his kid, and the woman and Yeatman started speaking. The woman knew he worked at Netflix, and she started asking him why there'd been no action against Masterson when he was starring and executive producing one of their shows, making a lot of money, and why hadn't they taken any action against these accusations he was facing? Andy Yeatman told the woman, oh, it's because we don't believe the victims. And what Andy Yeatman didn't know is that he was actually speaking to one of the victims. So when all of this came out in the media, obviously Netflix had to take action, and they not only fired Masterson, but they fired Yeatman. Andy Yeatman did an article in The Hollywood Reporter talking about this, and Masterson ended up being fired from the show and written off the ranch in kind of a leave it up in the air kind of way. There wasn't really a finality, and in my opinion, I would think that probably has to do with Ashton Kutcher hoping Masterson can make a grand return, because allegedly Ashton Kutcher was very much fighting not to get rid of Masterson, and his character, I believe, was like riding a motorcycle. The motorcycle crashed, but they never found out what happened to him, and it was just kind of left in a he's missing, presumed dead, but we don't know for sure. So after Masterson was fired from Netflix, he and his wife, Bijou Phillips, who is the daughter of John Phillips from the band The Mamas and the Papas, Masterson, Bijou Phillips, and their daughter end up moving to a vineyard, and Masterson starts basically selling wine, and he does like a sommelier course, and Bijou Phillips details all of this to the core in one of her letters that she wrote asking for a lenient sentence after Masterson was convicted. Before putting the house on the market, he did try 6 different lawsuits to get out of paying the mortgage, but they all failed, and that is when the house went on the market. This, as I said, was mentioned, just the house and it going on the market, in the letter that his ex-wife, Bijou Phillips, wrote to the court to try and get leniency for him when it came to his sentencing, and we'll talk a tiny bit more about that in a second. But there is a lot of little bits of information in these letters. There's 47 of them altogether, and in the intervening year and a half that I did this last video, there is so much stuff like that I've looked into, and there's a lot more to talk about, and that is why I also want to do an update video, because when you look into these houses too, there is information about all these different camera systems, and it has also lined up with some things that you see coming out in the Diddy trial. And I did very briefly mention the cameras in my original original video about the trial, but just there has been so much more time that I've been able to like dig into stuff. And I think that there's just a lot of stuff they mentioned in these letters that if you look at it on the surface, she's doing this whole thing saying, oh, he really, you know, picked up everything, and because he couldn't get acting at work anymore, and he sold the house and went and trained to be a sommelier and all this stuff. And then when you actually look at it, and he's trying 6 different lawsuits to get out of paying mortgages, and you know, these homes have all these, I mean, not just a couple of cameras. These are insane amounts of cameras with like a master room where you can see all of like the different ones. And it's just, and there's also records showing that these cameras, he was the one who put them in there. And it's just all a lot more to talk about. So just put that as a little flag for later. But I did want to mention about him trying to get out of paying the mortgage, because 6 lawsuits, I mean, come on. The investigation with Masterson goes over a number of years, and obviously he is arrested and charged, but there were actually 2 trials, because the first trial, the jury ended up being a hung jury. So the second trial was a retrial, and that is actually the trial where he ended up being convicted. He was on trial for 3 counts of rape, and he ended up being convicted of 2. The jury was hung on the 3rd count, and it wasn't like he was acquitted or anything. And they ended up not retrying that 3rd count because he'd already been convicted of those 2, and they knew with the sentencing that either way, he was going to be incarcerated for a number of years. Basically, the sentencing came down to he could end up serving the sentences consecutively or concurrently, meaning there could be one sentence for 15 years that ran for 15 years, and then the second one ran for another 15 years for a total of 30, or both could run at the same time and he would get out in 15 years. And all of the letters that most people aware of this case is that's probably one of the main things that they know, is that there were a number of celebrities who ended up writing letters to the judge pleading for leniency for Masterson in the sentencing. And that's what they were basically trying to sway the judge on, that he would either serve 15 years or 30 years. And the amount of people that wrote letters, most of them were Scientologists. Alanna and Jordan wrote letters. Chris Masterson did post his bail along with his mother, Carol. And on top of posting the bail, Chris Masterson and his mother, Carol, both wrote letters as well. Then there also were a number of other Scientology and Scientology adjacent celebrities. Eric Balfour, Giovanni Rivisi, Billy Baldwin, who is actually Danny Masterson's brother-in-law, because Billy Baldwin is married to Bijou Phillips' sister, and there's tons of other celebrities. And there were a number of That 70s Show co-stars of Masterson that wrote letters. Deborah Jo Rupp and Kurtwood Smith, who played Kitty and Red Foreman on the show. And of course, probably the most famous people who wrote letters, and the fact that they wrote letters went absolutely viral when, again, Tony Ortega, the Scientology journalist, ended up breaking this news that Ashton Kutcher and Mila Kunis had written letters on behalf of Masterson asking for leniency in his sentencing. Again, I get into this much more, not only in the Danny Masterson video, but also in a video I did about Ashton and Mila. But their letters in particular were just very trying to undercut, in my opinion, the court's decision and also the testimony of the Jane Does. They focused heavily on the fact that Masterson is very anti-drug, despite the fact that not only all of the victims of Masterson, but also the over a dozen other women who have come forward in some way or another, via social media or to the authorities about being alleged victims of Masterson, every single one of these victims has stated that their attack from Masterson involved being incapacitated by a substance. Ashton and Mila also just wildly praise Masterson. And one thing that a lot of people seem to misinterpret is that many people will say, oh, well, they wrote these letters because they're his friend and, you know, they're character letters and this and that. And what a lot of people don't understand or don't know is that these letters were written after the conviction. He had already been found guilty. And the only reason that Ashton and Mila, in my opinion, wrote these letters is because, one, they are still very close to him. They still socialize with his siblings, and the paparazzi takes pictures of them all the time out together. They're still very close to the family. But they wrote these letters because they thought that no one would ever know. They basically said that in that horrendous apology video that they released, where they didn't actually apologize. They apologized that people found out about the letters because they say, oh, these letters were for the judge and the court. And yeah, the video, I mean, I don't need to tell you about the video. I'm sure most people have seen it and are well aware of how badly it came across. And most people would think there's not really anything that can make a situation worse when you have written a letter praising a convicted serial rapist, but they really achieved it and they produced this video that did make the situation even worse. So despite the glowing letters of Alanna, Jordan, Ashton, Mila, Billy Baldwin, Giovanni Rivisi, Eric Balfour, and all the others, the judge sentenced him for 30 years to life in prison. And he doesn't become eligible for parole or anything like that. The only way that he might get a little bit off that sentence is because he will turn 65 while he's in prison and he's in California. There's a rule in California where if you turn 65, that if you meet this sort of eligibility and it's approved, you can be released. But he also is never guaranteed release or parole. Even though it's 30 to life, it doesn't mean that he automatically at 30 will walk out or get parole or anything like that. He could be in there for life. The earliest shot he has of getting out is if he meets this requirement when he turns 65, and that would be in 2041. He's now a resident of the California Men's Colony Prison, and he has tried to appeal. He has requested bail while his appeal is happening, and he ended up having this bail denied in January 2024 because what the judge ended up saying is that there's a chance that he could flee since he has means, and also because he ended up getting divorced in between his sentencing and this bail being denied. So he was sentenced in September 2023, and basically like a month and a bit after that, his wife, Bijou Phillips, ended up filing for divorce, and the divorce has, of course, happened now. He does have one daughter that he does have visitation and things like that with, but Bijou Phillips has now started dating someone else herself, a businessman named Jamie Mazur, and she pretty much, when Masterson went into prison, she then started to go back to her pre-Masterson life because she became a Scientologist whenever she started dating him and married him. Cutting in for the 27th time, I'm sure, but I found this interview that Bijou and Danny did together for Paper Magazine, and it's one of the only times that you see Bijou actually talking about Scientology. And oh boy, what a quote we have here. Honestly, Just when every time I think these people can't get any worse, they do. So I will probably talk about this interview more whenever I do the upcoming big update video, but is one of the worst interviews I have ever read. And I'm sure a little bit of that is hindsight and me knowing everything I know that's happened since this interview. But honestly, in my opinion, they just could not come across any worse. As I said, I'll get more into this in a future video, but I did just want to point out this lovely quote from Bijou that is her Scientology feelings when she was a practicing Scientologist, because apparently none of us should be taking meds and we should just all be sucking it up. Prior to that, she hung around with Paris Hilton and Nikki Hilton and went out and partied a lot. She actually hung around a lot with P. Diddy, and some people think that's how they actually got introduced, but I've never been able to confirm that. And ever since Masterson went to prison and she announced her divorce, she has gone back to being friends with Paris and Nikki and going out with them and posting on Instagram, and very different to when she was with Masterson and practicing Scientology. I don't know whether she's still a Scientologist because she hasn't said anything, but someone who still is a Scientologist is Danny Masterson, still a Scientologist in good standing according to the church. Most people I've spoken to about Masterson still being a Scientologist in good standing, it does seem to be the thought that this is primarily to do with his family and them being so insulated in Scientology and them being celebrity Scientologists, which there is no one higher in the Scientology pyramid than a celebrity Scientologist. And of course, with that family, you have all of the kids being famous actors, and obviously their mother too being a manager. There's lots of other Scientology actors that they all kind of do each other's projects and they all work with each other. Like Giovanni Rivisi's mother, Gay Rivisi, she's also her children's manager, and she's Elizabeth Moss's manager, who obviously is also a Scientologist, and they're all interrelated. And according to anyone I spoke to who's knowledgeable about Scientology and the Mastersons, they've said that if Danny was declared a suppressive person, that the family would probably not want to cut him off, that they would end up leaving because of that. And obviously, you know, other people can't say that for sure, like we're not inside their heads, but I don't think, in my opinion, Scientology would want to risk something like that now, because again, their numbers are so small, these are such prominent people, and they do have a lot of wealth. Scientology can't afford to be choosy right now because, I mean, their numbers seem to be dwindling a lot, but also in probably the last 5 or 6 years, a lot of celebrities have left and distanced themselves from Scientology, and a lot was seemingly to do with Danny Masterson, or if it wasn't the genesis of those celebrities leaving, it seems like it was the genesis of those celebrities speaking out. People like Laura Prepon and Jason Lee, they ended up saying that they left Scientology years before, but no one knew about it until everything started happening with Masterson, and all the articles started coming out saying, Danny Masterson, friends of Jason Lee and Laura Prepon, fellow Scientologists, and all of a sudden they started doing all these interviews like, "Oh, I'm not a Scientologist anymore. Oh, no, I've been gone for years." The Mastersons do seem extremely close. As I said, Chris Masterson and the mother posted his bail. Jordan and Alanna wrote letters after he had been convicted of violent serial. And I know some people will say it's their brother, but Alanna Masterson took it even further than a letter, because when the trial was happening, one of the victims was testifying, and the victim ended up having a panic attack on the stand. And so she asked to be excused and just take a few minutes to kind of calm down. And so her attorney took her into the women's restroom. And whenever the attorney and the victim went in there, the victim had been testifying. Like, everyone in court knew we're taking a break. The victim and her attorney are going to the bathroom. And according to Tony Ortega, who posted this on his site, The Underground Bunker, Alanna Masterson then went in to the bathroom and basically tried to intimidate the witness, and was standing there very close to her, like smiling and just making her be really uncomfortable when she was having like a panic attack. And it wasn't like she was going to the bathroom or anything like that. And I mean, your brother is on trial for doing one of the most horrendous, terrible things that you can do to someone. And they're having a panic attack, having to relive this in front of all these people testifying to this is what happens. They have a panic attack, go into the bathroom, and that's your reaction to go in there and try and intimidate them. So that was, I think, a big turning point in people's opinions about Alanna Masterson, as she, rightfully so, got a lot of pushback and backlash for those actions. One thing I forgot to mention in the video was Danny Masterson's original DJ name, and as I've been making this, I have found out like more stuff that will go into that future video, the like update video on him. But I did just want to mention it here as well, because this has been very much like wiped from the internet. I mean, there's like little references here and there if you kind of dig, but a lot of the stuff that I used in the original video, like little images, and there was also like some flyers and even like some of the articles. And the reason that they don't want this out there, and even at the trial, they actually had this mentioned by a witness, this DJ name, and the judge ended up saying, you know, strike that they mentioned that, because there was some sort of ruling that this couldn't be mentioned. I did try and find out why they weren't allowed to mention this name. I don't know whether it was some sort of, like, it was going to create some sort of bias or something, because it wasn't in any of the rulings that this couldn't be mentioned. It wasn't like how you couldn't talk about Scientology originally and then the defense entered in Scientology. But anyway, the whole reason that it is a very, I mean, it is a negative connotation anyway, but the reason that they especially didn't want it mentioned during this trial is because the original name was DJ Donkey Punch. And if you don't know what that is, congratulations. I didn't know what it was either until I had to look into this for the original video. And it basically is a very disgusting, sexual, hitting, just gross. And it very much is in line with some of the things he was accused of. So again, just disgusting. And this literally was something that he went by for years. He went by it from 97 until 2004. And this was pointed out by, again, the great Scientology journalist Tony Ortega. He stopped going by this name in 2004. And what else happened in 2004? That is when one of the Jane Does, one went to the LAPD, and the Scientology system ended up having the whole sit down with Masterson and the victim, and they made Masterson issue an apology, a written apology to the Jane Doe. So obviously this is just something being thrown out there, but if you were going by that name and you now knew that there were records in Scientology about one of these victims coming forward, you might stop going by the name. Or it could be that somebody's just told them, hey, maybe you shouldn't go by, you know, the name of a sexual assault. But I'll leave that up to you to decide what was going on there.
I mentioned the donkey punch.
Oh, yeah.
How does that become your DJ name? Just because you can't believe people are going to have to say it?
Yeah. So you sort of all come up with something that's kind of funny.
Right.
And mine was DJ Donkey Punch.
In regards to the Mastersons outside of the trial and Scientology and work, it does seem as though most of them have now settled down with partners. I don't believe Jordan Masterson is married, but he did have a long-term relationship with Dakota Johnson. He actually was dating her when she got cast on 50 Shades of Grey. And the family was seemingly close with Dakota Johnson when they were dating. They dated for about 2.5 years, I believe, because Alanna Masterson and Dakota Johnson seemed pretty close as well. They hung out a lot together and were posting all the time on social media together. And Jordan Masterson did also date Hilary Duff, who is best friends with Alanna Masterson. I know I've mentioned this before in a video, but Alanna Masterson and Hilary Duff, it's not like fake Hollywood friends. Like, they have been best friends for years and years and years and are extremely, extremely close. And they both have kids now too. So they're always posting each other on Instagram and everything. And as I said, their friendship goes back decades. Alanna and Jordan Masterson are also very good friends with Tom Cruise's kids. Apparently, Alanna and Connor Cruise did also very briefly date. I mean, only a few months, and it was quite a while ago, obviously, because she has 2 kids now, but apparently they did very briefly date. And they're very much this second generation of Scientology celebrity kids, because Danny and Chris, they're like the older batch of second generation Scientology kids, and they had a clique of Scientology friends. I always mention the restaurant bar La Poubelle, which everybody always laughs because it means trash can in French. And it is a trash can in my opinion, because Danny Masterson and all of them, it's their favorite haunt. And the owner of La Poubelle went every single day to the Masterson trial and was a person who wrote him a glowing letter as well. And it's right opposite the Celebrity Center in LA. And that is somewhere that Masterson and his clique of all the second generation Scientologists, not that they're the kids of Scientologists, but this clique was like Laura Prepon and Jason Lee and Giovanni Ribisi, he's obviously second generation, Beck the musician, Emily Armstrong, like all of them. And then the younger clique of second generation Scientology kids are like Jordan and Alanna Masterson and Isabella and Connor Cruise. It's going to be very interesting to see how the marketing and publicity plays out for the Malcolm in the Middle limited series when it comes out in December, because all of the Mastersons still have even like their Instagram comments on limited. And of course, you can tailor like media questions and things like that. And I'm sure they'll have, you know, PR and everybody on watch, but you can't as tightly control situations anymore like you could in the Malcolm in the Middle and That 70s Show days, where you knew, oh, it's only going to be these journalists and we're going to film this. But now with social media and everybody having a camera in their pocket, I'm sure there's going to be someone ask a question at some stage about Danny Masterson and the trial and all of this stuff. And I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of publicity around the Malcolm in the Middle revival. So it's definitely going to be interesting how they tackle it, unless they do something like just have the parents and Frankie Muniz, or like Frankie Muniz and Bryan Cranston doing like most of the publicity and like answering most of the questions. I'm sure right now there are Disney PR people coming up with strategies and any way to try and not have anyone ask or shut down anything about Danny Masterson or any of the Masterson Scientology skeletons that are definitely in that family's closet. I know this was a bit of a shorter video, but I had that last video that was an absolute monster. So if you want to know all the juicy behind the scenes gossip, lots of stuff that hasn't been talked about before, check out my last video. But I did also have, after those last 2 Scientology videos, I had a lot of people asking about Chris and Malcolm in the Middle and Masterson updates and things. So I thought this was a good way to consolidate it. And also, I'm literally going through the sale of my business right now. So next week, we'll be moving into our new era of full-time YouTube. I do still have one other job, but we will be doing a lot more content, lots of other things coming, lots of topics, and I'm hoping to get to 3 videos a month over the summer. So stay tuned for that. G and I just want to say thank you so much, especially if you make it to the end, if you watch all of our videos, some of our videos. I wouldn't be able to do YouTube full-time without you guys, so it is so appreciated. And if you did make it to the end, leave MVP below so I can personally thank you. I've left my Patreon and G&I social media down below. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, make sure to stay safe, take care of yourselves, and G and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye guys.